Unmute myself. Thank you everyone for joining us in our final essay readings for South Summit 2023. This essay reading is entitled Human Nature, read by Colleen Thurston, in which we explore what she calls Indigenous Diaspora. I'm Zuri Ovi, my pronouns are she, they, and I'm the Film and Conference Programmer here at New Orleans Film Society. It is an honor to introduce Oklahoma filmmaker Colleen Thurston, but before we get into the session, let me tell you a little bit about Colleen. Colleen Thurston is a documentary storyteller and a fellow film programmer from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her films explore the relationships between humans and the natural world and focus on the Indigenous perspective. Colleen has produced for the Smithsonian Channel, Vox, as well as museums, public television, and federal and tribal organizations. Her work has screened at international festivals and has been broadcasted nationwide. Colleen is also an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma, the project coordinator for the Indigenous video series Native Lens, and is the programmer for Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival. She is a Firelight Media Doc alum, a Sundance Institute Indigenous Film Fund Fellow, and a citizen of the Choctaw Nation. Thank you so much, Colleen, for joining us. Just a quick reminder, our Q&A, our chat box is open for questions. So throughout the conversation, please feel free to drop your questions and we'll address them throughout. Without further ado, I'm going to give the spotlight to Colleen so that they can share their ruminations and vignettes on Indigenous diaspora. Thank you, Colleen.
Great. Thank you so much, Suri. It's really been an honor being here with everyone over the past couple of days. I love South Summit, and I'm really pleased and honored to be asked to write something for you all. So here we go. The last time I was in New Orleans while pitching the documentary I'm currently making, someone at the pitch asked me, "What do you mean when you talk about an Indigenous diaspora?" Which was an identifying phrase I used in my description of the themes of the film. I suppose to some, those words are diametrically opposed. Diaspora meaning the dispersion or dispossession of people from their homelands. Indigenous meaning being native to a specific place. But the majority of Indigenous people in my state, Oklahoma, to us, diasporic is the definition of our existence. We were and still are Indigenous to our homelands, which are now the American South, but we were forcibly removed from those homelands to the land that was then called Indian Territory, Oklahoma. Okla meaning people, Homa meaning red. In the Choctaw language, land of the red people. When we got there, we named it as our own, after ourselves, and then began the long process of making it home. Not homelands, but home. In a timed pitch session, I didn't have the capacity to explain in detail the complications of existing as a dispossessed Indigenous person in a nation within a nation, in a region known as the South. But is Oklahoma even the South? Is another question I've had directed towards me too many times to count, said with a Southerner than you inflection, sometimes from people who live in our homelands and who identify as Southerners themselves. But before Oklahoma was home, we were the original Southerners. The Choctaw, my people, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Muskogee, the Cherokee. Our nations and reservations encompass nearly half of Oklahoma, but our presence blankets the South still. It's the Choctaw culinary knowledge that provides filet powder for filet gumbo. The Southern staple of cornbread comes from Indigenous cuisine. Our language is slow and spoken with a drawl. Our place names dot the Southern landscape: Atchafalaya, Tuscaloosa, Tallahatchie. Oklahoma is far from the only place we named. But the places named by us with our language and our homelands are the ones from which we've been forced to disconnect. Just as I've been asked, I have asked my own questions about Southern and diasporic identities. Is that land really the South, or is it the old nations? Are nations land-based? What happens to national identity when an entire nation moves? What if the United States, its people and government, was suddenly forced to move elsewhere to someone else's land? How would US citizens' identity change if their land base suddenly changed? So am I a Southerner if my people's identity was only based in the South since time immemorial? How can the South be sanctuary if it's a place we were forced to flee? A sanctuary is a place of refuge, of safety, where you're held close and in comfort. It's a complicated term when you belong to the land, when you define yourself not just by where you live, but by where your nation is, and maybe also where your homelands are. Reflecting on these questions and considering how the land can define identity, I think perhaps it's just as much about where you're from and where you live as it is about how these places affect our physical bodies and the stories we tell about the places and ourselves within these places. Some Indigenous people define themselves by their water source in introductions and as an actual Indigenous land acknowledgement. Presently, I am of the Arkansas River. It's what makes up my physical body, and it's where I live and where I was born. But my DNA holds memory of water from generations back. I don't know the words for the generational water that made me. That knowledge was lost or not passed down. Maybe it was Caddo Creek. Maybe 7 generations ago, it was the Tallahatchie River when we lived near what is now Greenwood, Mississippi, before the removal. Greenwood, named for a Choctaw chief, Greenwood LaFleur. Tallahatchie, named from the Choctaw words Tully, meaning rock, and Hutcha, meaning river, river of rocks. I'd guess more people know it for its relationship to the fictional Billy Joe McAllister, who jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge and Bobby Gentry's country song, or for the horrific lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till, whose body his murderers threw in the Tallahatchie. I don't know the Choctaw stories of this river, though. Were they lost when we were separated from it? Is the river the only one who holds that knowledge now? Ili Hutcha, Ili meaning death, Hutcha meaning river, river of death. Identities can change. The river wants and always provides life, though. I'm making a film about rivers, one river in particular, the Kaimishi. This river exists wholly in the Choctaw Nation, the new nation in Oklahoma. One of the film's protagonists, Sandy, told me when we were removed as Choctaw people to this country, when they got here and they saw this river, they must have felt better because they knew there was water. Was this when they, our ancestors, began to identify themselves by this new river as people of the Kaimishi? Just as in the old nation and this new one, the rivers provide for us and define us. Water provides hope and comfort. Water provides clarity and cleansing. Water is a sanctuary. Rivers are places of beginning. They are life sources. With Sandy, I visited the spring-fed headwaters of the Kaimishi and the mountains of southeastern Oklahoma and the Choctaw Nation. The water trickles out of the earth there, a tiny bubbling that moistens the clay and creates a small furrow that ever so gradually widens as the trickle becomes a stream. Here, the headwaters resemble a birth canal. It's where the community and the ecosystem of the river valley are born of the Kaimishi. The river is the matriarch of the area. I don't have the knowledge of the ancestral waters that made me. When we were removed from our homelands, we stopped passing down some of our knowledge, dealing with the trauma of removal, of genocide on the Trail of Tears. Some stories and oral traditions were lost or halted. With the disconnection from the land came a disconnection from cultural knowledge. from the language that belongs to the place and from place-based identity. In Oklahoma, we were reborn as people. We are resilient, but the trauma did inform the stories we tell ourselves, and colonization shaped our cultures. We lost our focus on our traditional matriarchy and on centering life sources, mothers, women, water, as the creators of us as people. To know who we are, we must know who made us. I have a clip from the documentary I'm working on, Drowned Land, featuring Sandy and Charlotte, two of the film's protagonists, as they reflect on the significance of the Kiamichi River and how it relates to our traditional matriarchal society and the need to reclaim that.
Going back to that thought process of how we think about things, when you become a mother in a matriarchal society, you're not just the mother of one child anymore. It's a different sense of responsibility. It's a sense of responsibility for all things that you touch.
I remember the first time I recognized my responsibility as a mother. I'd taken Kai to one of our lakes, and he was maybe 2, was teaching him how to float. I was holding his head, and I had let go the rest of his body, and he looked up at me, and with the most intense, truthful trust, he looked in my eyes and he trusted me completely. I feel that when I'm with this river that gives life to this valley, that she would hold her head above water if she could.
For as long as I can remember, I've been a water person. The first immersion in an Oklahoma lake in the summer brings a full body sigh of contentment, a refuge from the stifling heat and humidity. It's when the water in me is balanced by its surrounding liquid kin. I'm most at ease in water. Water composes me and it comforts me. It is my sanctuary. Water is alive. It holds memory. It creates us. It defines us, and it holds our histories and stories. It's the stories that we tell ourselves about place, about identity, about who we are as cultures, as humans, that bring us a sense of communal self-awareness. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are can be as self-assured as a free-flowing river, winding its way through the land, knowing where to go and knowing where it comes from. So in stories, we claim our being. Diasporas are free-flowing, and while disconnected from homelands, diasporic communities give birth to new ways of being, new streams off of main waterways. When we were removed to Oklahoma, we brought our seeds with us to grow food to provide for us and future generations. Seeds grown for generations in Choctaw, Southern soil. Seeds born of a life giver that create and sustain life. We plant our seeds, corn, squash, beans, tobacco, peas, in the land wherever we remain, and we nourish them with the water of the land. Right now, I have corn sprouting from heirloom Choctaw seeds in my backyard in Tulsa. My son helped me plant our Tanchi Toby. Tanchi meaning corn, Toby meaning white. This is the corn that is used to make cornmeal for my favorite, cornbread. These are the seeds that made the trek from the old nation in the South with us and that have survived their own displacement. Though the soil and the water may be different, we grow where we are planted. We create and sustain life. I don't know if I'm Southern, but I do know where I'm from. I'm born of the Arkansas River and 7 generations removed from the Mississippi River Delta. The water that ran through my grandparents' bodies now runs through mine. And the stories I tell, the language I use about place, about history, will run through the next 7 generations as well. Thank you all so much. Yakoki.
Thank you so much for sharing those words in this beautiful scene. Just the scene, like the river, the trees, the fog creeping over the sleepy waters, like a lot. I'm in love with the American South and its landscape. So thank you for sharing that. And also thank you for helping us understand sanctuary as a diaspora, not necessarily a fixed point in space and time. I think that's a really important distinction, especially when it comes to, your Southernness and your identity. So yeah, I also kind of want to lean into that because I know that you, that's something that you identify with is the Indigenous diaspora. And one quote that struck me was our nation's land base and what happens when national identity, what happens to national identity when they move, right? This ties into like your core identity and what you call Indigenous diaspora. How does Indigenous diaspora inform or explain how you feel about your Southernness? Because I know you feel like it's really complicated. But yeah, tell us more about Indigenous diaspora and how for you, Southernness is more of a migratory legacy and not necessarily a fixed space and land because you were displaced,
Yeah. I think I've heard other people say this over the past couple of days, but this the narratives that I think people in the South and people in rural areas too have consumed of like, we need to leave, you have to go somewhere else, right? To make your way in the world or like be somebody, right? And I've definitely felt that, like growing up in Oklahoma, I'm like, this is the most backwards place, like I have to leave, I have to go, I'm not even supposed to be here. I was forced here. Our people were forced here. I'm not even supposed to be here. This isn't who I am. And I did leave when I was 18 and I lived elsewhere for like 12 years before I moved back. But in my 20s, I visited Mississippi for the first time. And I was looking for those roots. And I thought that I'm going to go there and that's where I'm going to feel at home. Right. That's who I am. That's the soil that made me. Right. And I got there and I had such a visceral reaction to being there. And I very clearly got the message that this is not who I am. I am not of this land. Maybe generationally I am. And like I said, it was so strange seeing our language everywhere. But then realizing I am of the place where my nation currently is, which is Oklahoma. So yeah, I mean, it's complicated, but I think in a lot of ways it's, if an Irish American person went to Ireland, they might have connections there and they might feel this is the place that made me in a lot of ways, but I am now different. I am now separate from this. So yeah, but I still have that like strange sense of ownership over that land and of the memories that are held in the land and the water and the stories because we did lose them in a lot of ways, not all of them, but we did. So I definitely feel the need to like reclaim ancestral homelands in a way that doesn't mean I have to occupy them.
Yeah, it's this idea of like renegotiating connection and relationship to nature based on like political impact, right? Because like initially a lot of like Indigenous folks would identify with the land, right? But when land was impermanent, it became the river. And it's really interesting how river and water shows up in your work a lot, right? And I started thinking of this idea of like, the river is like a metaphor for diaspora, like this constant movement, but still containing oneself in a space, right? So water is like a theme, not only in your essay, but also in your films. I mean, you named your film Drowned Land. So I'm really wanting to understand your particular connection to water. You know, I have my connection with water. I'm Cancer, I'm a water baby. I was born in June and I grew up in Miami next to the beach, right? So I kind of feel out of whack. I feel kind of like a little just not wrapped, you know, if I'm not by a moving body of water. It really undergirds just my sense of self and peace. So I'm wondering, you know, what if that resonates with you, because you more resonate with river and you're doing a story about rivers. Like, what is the importance of water to your Southernness, your identity, to your identity as Indigenous diasporic, you know, and how does that inform your work and your film? Because you loved water before doing a film about it. And now it's like this beautiful reverie and kind of collaboration with water in creating this story. So I kind of want to know, like, what does water do for you?
Yeah. You know, we have this idea of like Southern Gothic, right? Like that's usually applied to literature, but I think we can apply it to a lot of films as well. And in this like narrative style of like Southern Gothic, there's a heaviness. And I think it's often illustrated by the landscape, right? It's the Spanish moss, it's the like willows, and it's the swamps, it's the like bogginess, and it's like the creatures that live in these landscapes. And in those landscapes, it is humid. And so, you know, when we see Oklahoma on screen, it's like where the wind comes sweeping down the plains. It's like, it's Western Oklahoma, which is like a very different landscape. And for me, Eastern Oklahoma, which is where like the 5 tribes I mentioned are located, it is hilly. It is basically the foothills of the Ozarks. It is mountainous, you know, as we know what southern mountains look like. And it's wet. There's a lot of water. We have more man-made lakes in Oklahoma than any other state. They're man-made, and they're mostly in the eastern part of that state. So there's this like heaviness, there's this like humidity, there's just like, that's the existence, right? You start to feel like oddly, like torturously nostalgic for this existence that we all survive every summer, right? And so water is the reprieve from that. And because we have all of these lakes, it's so easy to get there. It's so easy to go swimming and just have this like moment of like calm and serenity in the like unbearable 115 degrees with like 80% humidity. So for me, you know, water, like we always went camping at the lakes as a kid, so that brought me a lot of joy and adventure in addition to that calmness. And this is, you know, really opening a can of worms here, but the film that I'm working on came out in a lot of ways because my grandfather was an engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers, and he helped design and build a lot of the dams in Eastern Oklahoma that dammed our rivers, which did a lot of damage. It damaged the ecosystem, and it displaced a lot of people who, again, came from a history of displacement. But in creating these lakes, it also creates a safe haven and an escape. So again, it's just like these very kind of complicated ways of looking at our landscape and relating to our landscape.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, to see kind of the just the nuancing of that decision, right? That this idea to like dam rivers, but when you dam rivers, you build lakes, right? That's just really interesting. And so, and I actually want to pivot to your film, and we could talk more about your grandfather. You said, right, grandfather?
My grandmother.
Yeah. So yeah, pivoting back to Drowned Lands, at the end of that clip, you know, one quote that really struck out with me to me was when a woman said, remind me of her name, that was speaking, had glasses on, and she said, I feel that when I'm with this river, this gives life to the valley. I feel that she would hold her head up above water if she could, right? That was just a really striking and beautiful just quote for me. And it kind of folds into the quote of your essay when you're saying that, you know, your water holds memory and your DNA holds water from generations back, right? So it feels like we're drawing some powerful metaphors between motherhood, womb space, matriarchy. Can we talk more about that? Like what are these connections that you're making, and how does it help you understand yourself as existing with water, or as water being something that provides life, right? Infinite life, and that in a way of, you know, I have this image of like this mother that would do anything, and even to their detriment, to keep their offspring, their generations alive. So kind of like their detriment is the survival of future generations, which is kind of like a river. So yeah, tell me more about that parallel you're drawing in your film.
Yeah. I kind of entered the narrative of this film because the Kaimishi River is at risk of being dammed again. And it's also at risk of having 85% of its water piped out of the Choctaw Nation and piped away 200 miles away to Oklahoma City.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, that would be incredibly detrimental to the community, not only because they're subsisting off of the river, but also because there's a cultural approach to looking at the river as the lifeblood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Sandy, one of the women that we heard from, she told me early on when I met her, she was like, this is the heart of the entire community, and the area is the body, and what happens if you cut off the heart from the body, right? You cease to exist. So you can't live without the water source. And when I met both of these women, I was kind of thinking, I'm like, okay, well, how are we going to show this fight to protect the water? And, you know, we went to court, but there weren't like major protests, like we saw with like Standing Rock, for example. Like there wasn't something like that. And as a filmmaker, I'm like, but what's the visuals, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how do we show this? And then in talking with them more, I'm realizing and hearing what they're saying, that like that's you know, in these kind of binary ways of approaching action, that's not the traditional feminized way of fighting. And they're thinking like, we need to pray, we need to focus on the positive, we need to envision what needs to happen here, and not get caught up in the basically like, you know, the combat of it all. And so that's when I started asking them, like, why is this the approach? And they started telling me, it's like our society, we lost so many of our matriarchal ways, that in order to protect this river, we can protect it in court, we can protest, we can sign that, but that's just winning the battle. Like this is going to continue with another project, another proposal, another diversion, until we shift our paradigm, until there's a paradigm shift in how we approach living things and life givers. So that's where that whole idea of of reclaiming the matriarchy and rematriation as the key to environmental protection and therefore cultural protection as well. Indigenous stewardship of the land goes hand in hand with environmental conservation, right? So that's really been their approach, and that's really what has steered a lot of the themes and pacing of the story as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. It's just the idea of like, it's a river, but let's call it what it is. It's a life source, right?
Yeah.
It is the vein, the blood of everything that we use to build culture, build identity, build civilizations, right? Next to rivers, next to waters is where civilization starts to build up and it goes outward. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, and just a new reverie, not a new reverie, because I love water, I worship water, but really just putting it into context of the spirit of water, not the actual physical existence of it. So yeah, so let me stop talking because I feel like there's some folks that might have some questions. If not, we can move to some other questions that I have, because I can question you all day or just talk to you all day.
Yeah. I can also just to add to that as well, like there are cultures throughout the world, notably in New Zealand, the Maori, who recognize water and rivers especially as sentient beings. So they have personhood and they have rights. And that's a goal of the water protectors within this story and within my nation.
Water is personhood. Yeah, this is really, really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing these words. So as we close out, we don't have any questions, but I'm wondering for the folks that first of all, what stage is Drownland in? And yeah, tell us about that.
Post. We are
Okay.
finally 5 years later. Yeah, we're in post, and hope to have a cut by midsummer.
Summer, nice. And where can we go to just watch your other work and support your work that you've worked on previously?
Yeah, I should make a website.
I feel like a lot of like artists and filmmakers are like, I don't know, like I don't have social media, I don't have, because like we're really just doing the work, and it's like, oh yeah, we have to like be out in the world. We forget.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a website for the film. It's drownedland.com. And so one day that to-do list priority of making a website will move to the top of the list. But yeah, I'm like on Instagram.
Are you on Instagram? Because we can drop your Instagram here.
I
Get you some
am.
followers.
I just put it in the chat. Yeah.
Nice. Thank
And
you so much.
I will check it in 2 weeks and then be like, oh, okay.
You'd be like, oh yeah, like have 100 new followers from this amazing talk.
There's only 37 people here, but all of a sudden I have 100 followers.
I mean, some people have different accounts, I'm sure. But no, thank you so much for your time, your thoughts, and your words, Colleen, and just for sharing your sense of sanctuary. I think a lot of the conversations have pivoted around sanctuaries, like the physical structure of it, like mountains, trees, physical homes. But you really took the idea of just sanctuary into a space that you feel, and it can't necessarily pack up and take with you, right? More than like your spirit and yourself. So really thank you for sharing that with us. We're going to move into our next music break. I'm telling you, these playlists are popping. The camera's been off, but I've been dancing in between. So we're followed by a music break. And then at 3 p.m., we will wrap up South Summit with our final panel session, The Great Remigration, in which I will be moderating and be in conversation with C.V. Ray Warren, Abe Felix, and John Sestry, talking about making home with the artists. This concludes our essay panel with Colleen. Thank you so much, and I'll see everyone at 3.
Thank you.
Thank you.